you are going to be applying nitrogen in the fall. You want to make sure you're using materials that are going to be very slow to break down because we don't want to get that conversion over to nitrate very quickly. So again, you want to use materials that are going to be more high carbon as compared to a lower carbon material. And then in the spring is when we want to think about putting on materials. Go back to that slide I showed you that has the carbon-nitrogen ratio of some fertilizer materials. You want to go with something that's going to become more available more quickly, because that's when the crop is really going to need that nitrogen at that point. Okay. Now, having said all that, and Crystal is doing some work that hopefully we're going to get a better idea of looking at things beyond the ammonium nitrate that they were looking at. I know Crystal has some organic materials in there. We're also looking at the fall and spring applications and rates and everything, and timing as well. But again, I had to go back about 15 years to find something that is pertinent to what we're doing here in New York. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And again, this was work, a lot of the work that we did here and reported on was things that were done 15 years ago. Yes?
So, you were saying that garlic has a real shallow root system?
Compared to many vegetable crops.
Oh.
Yeah.
Does it go down too far?
Typically, what will happen, and actually years ago, somebody spent a lot of time digging down 5 feet and looking at the roots of vegetables. And what they found was that there were some that could get down that far if it wasn't that they'd hit a hard pan. With garlic, it seemed like they could get down typically around 18 inches, but most of the uptake was being done in about the top 8 inches. Okay, so that's where the real active zone was. Okay. Yeah, the question was, with the nitrogen application, do you think it will make a difference in terms of whether you're broadcasting it or if you're banding it? And that's a good question. Typically, if you're broadcasting it, not as much of that nitrogen you're putting out there is going to be available to the crop. Some of it's going to get lost. The roots just aren't going to be out there. So banding is usually a better option, and there's some people that will say if you're banding a nitrogen fertilizer, you might want to take off 10 to 20% of the amount that you're applying because more of it's going to be available. Or conversely, if you're broadcasting it, maybe add 20% onto it. But that can make a difference in terms of how that's being applied. Good question. One question back here.
Yeah. You mentioned using sulfur to bring the pH down. I presume that doesn't need as much time to react with soil as lime would to go the other way?
It needs less time, but it's still compared to some reactions in the soil, it's a little bit slower than some. But probably not doesn't take nearly as long as what you have with limestone. And if you've got a soil that maybe the pH is right, but you're concerned that the sulfur levels are low, another option would be using something like gypsum, which adds calcium and sulfur to the soil. Okay, and doesn't change the pH.
So applying end of May, early June, 10, 20, 20 fertilizer, make a bigger ball, revert to the dust.
From the results I've seen here and from other places, it seems like if you're putting that fertilizer on that late, so the question was using 10, 20, 20?
We have 5, 10, 10.
5, 10, 10, something with that ratio, and putting it on in late May. Would it make a difference in terms of the
Is it going to make a bigger ball either time?
It depends on your soil test. If your soil test is low in phosphorus and your soil is low in phosphorus, that additional phosphorus is going to help make a bigger bowl. If your test levels are adequate, it's probably not going to make a difference. And you really want to get that on probably earlier than even early May. Because with the phosphorus, it's not going to go anywhere. If anything, it will weather in and get down to the roots.
But there is a possibility of making a bigger ball.
If your soil levels are low. Yep, absolutely. Yes?
So, I have a tendency to use some of the Crayer's 833 in the spring, but from what I'm seeing here, if I put an application in end of March, 1st of April, and like this year, the soil's pretty cold.
Yeah.
4% of it is feather meal, which is slow, and 4% of it is blood meal, which is faster. So the blood meal is going to activate hopefully right away, but then am I kind of shooting myself in the foot because I'm going to lose that other 4%, it's going to not get in, maybe 3 weeks of April? Or?
So the question here was using a material, an organic material, that about half of the nitrogen is very available, the other half would be more slowly available. Would that more slowly available nitrogen be available to the crop later? I think it would, even if it's 3 weeks later, because you're going to put the blood meal that's in there, is going to be available very quickly.
But would it be better to maybe just use something like a 16-0 like chili nitrate immediately and lots of it, and just skip the because of the slow release?
So the question was, would it be better just to use a quicker release nitrogen material than a slower release at the beginning of the season and be done with it? What kind of soil do you have?
Mine's like a clay body,
Okay. If you've got a heavier soil and you've got clay in it, it's a loamier soil, it probably wouldn't make a difference. The leaching aspect is not going to be as bad as if you're growing this on a more sandier soil. Heavier soils, leaching potential is not quite the same. So I kind of like the mix of something that's giving me something that's quick release, so it's getting into the roots now, and it's going to be something that would be available later on. And that's the advantage you've got with organic fertilizer than when you're just using something like ammonium nitrate or something that's very quickly available.
So the seed meals, would they be considered as slow breakdown?
For the most part. So the question was, would the seed meals be considered a slow breakdown? Probably, if you're looking at the typical springtime temperature in the soil, yeah, I think they would match up very well with the garlic's needs.
We used to use soybean meal in the fall, and thought they said it would be more available in the spring for the wind breakdown.
Yeah, it probably would be. Again, it depends, as we talked about, the potential that some of it could be totally converted to nitrate, might not even be available in the spring. So, and again, talking with Crystal, and I'd like to get some input from you folks, is, we think about adding organic matter to our soils, we don't think about the crop that we're actually growing as we're planting that. I mean, it's a good-sized clove you've got out there. That's actually adding some significant nutrients as compared to when you're planting a seed compared to the clove. So, yes?
I've been plowing down like alfalfa in the facade in the fall. I have hay in my rotation. I would usually try to pick our spot where there's less timothy with concern about wireworm. But what do you think about using that as a nitrogen source?
So using Timothy alfalfa, you're going to get a nice amount of nitrogen. Some of it will be leached, but there'll be more than enough available. I was surprised there was some work that Harold Van Ness did where they looked at fall plowing of alfalfa and how much nitrogen was actually lost. A lot of it depending on the time of year. The more earlier it was done when the soil was warmer, more conversion, more potential leaching. So it sort of depends on the time of year, but even with that, it's going to make a nice source of nitrogen for the crop. It might provide almost all the nitrogen you need.
So it'd be better probably to plow it like almost immediately prior to when it's not the garlic.
Yeah, later in the fall is better. You don't want to do it too close to when you're planting the garlic because sometimes that can, just having that level of organic matter, fresh organic matter, sometimes can cause some problems. So it's best to wait a little while. Try to find that perfect window.
How long would you recommend?
Well, in the spring we usually recommend 2 to 3 weeks between the time we plow in a cover crop and when we planting. And part of that is to let some of it rot. Some of it is because it attracts maggots, which I don't think is the same problem in the fall as you would in the spring. I'm not an entomologist.
Since the soil's cooler, you're going to get slower breakdown.
Yes.
So it should be longer in the fall. Probably.
Should be longer.
You don't really know how much longer at this point.
It depends so much on the temperatures. It's hard
But
to
you
say.
don't actually know the time you do the flow down. You don't know what the weather's going to be.
You don't.
For the next 2 or 3 or 4 weeks.
You have a hard time knowing what the weather will be tomorrow, I think.
Steve, maybe I didn't understand something. You talked about 3-leaf stage. That's pretty late, it seems to me. Most of us like to put it in spike stage, but I would use a very light amount of chili and nitrate early and then put a second in maybe at 3-leaf stage.
Well, yeah, I mean, they went up to the 3 to 5 leaf stage. I don't think, from what I've seen here, that it's going to hurt you in terms of putting it down at the earlier stage. Because what we saw was even where they, when they put it down at the 3-leaf stage and they put a higher amount down later on, you started to see the yields go down. Putting it on earlier is probably not going to hurt. It's got the potential for leaching, but as I said, unless you're on a very gravelly, sandy soil, and I don't think there's many garlic growers that grow on that type of soil, you probably are okay with putting that on.
Do you think it's going to uptake that that, the reason I would use chilling early because typical organic fertilizers won't mineralize at that temperature.
Right. Yeah, and certainly would be available as that plant is starting to grow. It's already used all the nitrogen that was available from the mother clone. So it's going to start to need something in that point. Okay. You probably could wait maybe a little bit longer, but again, that's something we've really got to tease out because they looked at the 3 leaf stages, the earliest they were applying. It would be good to see, well, what happens if we apply it earlier? Hopefully we'll be able to do that in crystals. So, yeah, what he was talking about, you apply the nitrogen and typically a mulch, some kind of a straw mulch is being put over it. It's not the same as turning a cover crop or an alfalfa crop, timothy crop in. It would be very different. You'd have much more nitrogen available on the alfalfa crop than you would in the straw. Much more carbon in the straw. It'd be slower to break down. Wouldn't have that much of an impact. The straw mulch would probably not have that much of an impact on the nitrogen as an alfalfa or timothy turn. Yes, Dave?
What about taking some of these solid fertilizers and putting them in as a liquid?
So is the question, is a liquid more available?
You take the Reiners and mix it with water and chisel it.
It will make it somewhat more available. And we get this question a lot from conventional growers who want to know whether a liquid fertilizer is more available than a solid. And that what they're thinking is, well, it's got some water in it, the plant needs the water to pick that up. But when you look at it over the per acre basis, the amount of water we're putting on is so small, it doesn't really have much of an impact to really help the plants pick that up. So typically, even with the liquid form, it goes in, it dries out, it's almost going to act the same as if a dry material went in.
Our idea was to try to get it below ground. I don't know, I guess the one question for everybody would be after they apply, how are they incorporating it?
Right.
When are they incorporating it?
Yeah. Because if it's just sitting on the surface, something's got to get it into the soil to the roots. Now, are you going to rely on the rain to do that, or are you going to be incorporating that yourself? And if you're using material that's converting over to ammonium and it's sitting on the soil surface, you're going to smell the nitrogen cycle.
So the growers that are using organic mulch, they can't put it below ground.
Right. And I think what they were doing in the study that I talked about here was they had it mulched, they pulled back the mulch, apply the nitrogen, and then put the mulch back on, which seems like a lot of work, but.
How many growers are using the mulch?
Yeah, the Fisher mulch, any type of foliar spray will give you a nice mix, especially of some of the minor elements. Yeah, yeah. The problem with any of the foliar sprays is if you're hoping to put a lot of nitrogen down on it, it's probably only going to give you a few days worth of nitrogen.